I want to be upfront about something before I tell this story. I've told it exactly twice in my life, once to my brother Danny, the night I got back sitting in his kitchen at midnight while he tried to figure out whether to be worried or skeptical, and ended up being both. And once to my therapist about 8 months after the fact, when I finally admitted that the thing at Kellner Lake was not something I was going to process on my own, no matter how long I gave it. My therapist is a careful and intelligent woman, and she did not tell me I was wrong about what I'd experienced. She told me that the experience was real, and that the fear was real, and that what I chose to do with both of those things was up to me. Danny told me it was probably a bear with mange. He's my little brother, and he loves me, and that's the kindest thing he could have said in the circumstances, which is why I let him say it and didn't argue. I'm 51 years old. I spent 23 years as a law enforcement officer in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, 8 years as a patrol officer with the Marquette County Sheriff's Department, and 15 as a detective mostly on property crimes and missing persons, and the occasional violent incident that the UP produces in smaller quantities than downstate, but with its own particular character. I retired in February of 2020 officially for reasons of accumulated stress and the natural endpoint of a career that had given what it had to give. Those reasons are true. They are not the complete truth. The complete truth includes Kellner Lake. I'm writing this down now 4 years later because I've spent those 4 years carrying something that I think other people should know about, and because my son Marcus is studying forestry at Michigan Tech and is going to spend his professional life in exactly the kind of country where what happened to me happened, and I owe him the real version, even if the real version is the one that's harder to tell. My name is Ray Kowalski. I grew up in Ishpeming, which is a small iron mining town in the central UP about 15 miles west of Marquette. I spent my working life in Marquette, and I retired back to Ishpeming to my late mother's house, which felt like going backward geographically, but turned out to be the right call in every other sense. My daughter Britta is in Chicago working in healthcare administration and calls me every Sunday evening. My son Marcus is in Houghton finishing his forestry degree. I have a brother Danny who lives in Marquette and runs a small electrical contracting business and is the best person I know. I am not, as I've said, easily frightened. I want to establish this clearly and with specifics because the story I'm about to tell involves fear that I have no other reference point for, and I need you to understand the baseline before I describe the departure from it. In 23 years of law enforcement in the UPI responded to accidents on frozen roads in February that had produced outcomes I won't describe. I found people in the woods who had been missing long enough that finding them was not the good outcome. I was involved in 3 situations where a weapon was discharged at or near me, one of which resulted in an injury to my left arm that required surgery and 6 weeks of rehabilitation. I sat with families at the worst moments of their lives and delivered information that could not be made gentle, no matter how carefully you chose your words. None of those experiences produced uncontrollable fear. They produced appropriate responses, elevated heart rate, elevated awareness, the specific narrowing of focus that the body uses to optimize performance under stress. What they did not produce was the kind of fear that takes over your body and tells your rational mind to sit down and be quiet. Kellner Lake produced that. Kellner Lake is why I know the difference. Let me tell you about the lake before I tell you what happened there, because understanding the place is part of understanding the story. Kellner Lake is a 40-acre natural lake in the Ottawa National Forest, approximately 60 miles northeast of Marquette. To reach it, you take a Forest Service road that most people outside the area don't know exists. And off that road, you take a two-track that has never been formally maintained and that requires a truck with decent clearance to navigate in all but the driest conditions. Even in good conditions, it's a slow drive. The two-track winds through dense second-growth forest, crosses a small creek on a culvert that has been repaired by various parties over the years, using materials of varying quality, and eventually opens into a small clearing near the lake's north end, where there's a concrete boat ramp that some Forest Service crew put in decades ago, and that has been slowly losing its argument with tree roots ever since. The lake itself is shaped roughly like a kidney, which is common for lakes formed by glacial action in this part of the state. The north end, where the ramp is, has a rocky shoreline, granite outcroppings, some of them large enough to stand on, creating points and pockets that smallmouth bass use as ambush positions. The south end transitions into a bog, the shoreline going from rock to sphagnum, moss to open water in stages, the bottom soft and deep, and producing the kind of weedy structure that perch and bluegill use in summer and fall. Between the north's rocky clarity and the south's boggy obscurity, there are 2 miles of mixed shoreline that change character every 100 yards. The forest around the lake is the thing that makes it what it is. Second-growth white pine and red pine, some of it now old enough to be substantial, mixed with paper birch and aspen, along the ridges and cedar swamp in the low spots. The pines are dense enough that on the north shore the canopy closes overhead and the forest floor is dim even at midday, the light filtering through green and gray in a way that makes the whole thing feel like it's underwater. The undergrowth is sparse under the pine's pine needle duff and occasional fern, and not much else, but in the transition zones and around the bog, there's dense tag alder and other shrub that can make movement difficult. The nearest other human structure to Kellner Lake as of 2019 was a seasonal camp about 8 miles south that I had not seen occupied in several years. The nearest paved road was about 12 miles. Cell service at the lake was non-existent in any network I'd tried over the years. I first fished Kellner Lake when I was 14 years old, brought there by my Uncle Vic in his aluminum canoe from his camp on another lake south of it. Vic was a dedicated UP fisherman of the old-school, patient, methodical, deeply knowledgeable, and possessing of the particular contentment that comes from people who have found their right activity and have had decades to get good at it. He introduced me to Kellner Lake on an August morning that I remember in considerable specific detail, and which remains one of my cleaner memories from a childhood that had its complicated passages. We caught smallmouth bass until our arms were tired, and we ate lunch on a granite outcropping on the north shore. And Vic said, with the quiet authority of a man who had earned his opinions honestly, that this was one of the best places he knew of, and that I should remember that. I went back the following summer on my own. I was 15, and I talked my father into lending me the truck for a weekend, and I drove up with a tent and a canoe tied to the roof rack and 3 days of food. And I spent those 3 days in a state of contentment that I would spend the next 35 years trying to recreate in various forms. I went back the summer after that. I went back most summers after that and most falls, and occasionally in the winter when the lake was frozen and I wanted to sit on the ice with a tip-up and the kind of silence that only exists in the UP in January. By 2019, I had been fishing Kellner Lake for 36 years. In 36 years, I had encountered other people at the lake maybe 15 times. It is not a popular destination. The access is too difficult for most people, and the fishing, while good, is not spectacular enough to justify the effort if you have easier options. What Kellner Lake has, and what it had always had, was a quality of solitude that I had never found anywhere else, a sense of being genuinely away, not just far from town, but removed from the whole texture of human density. Even in summer, the silence there was different from other silences. It had weight to it. History. In October of 2019, I drove up for what I planned as a 4-day trip. I had just come off a case that I'm not going to detail here, a missing person in the Huron Mountains, that had ended in the way those cases most often end when they take long enough, and that had accumulated in me the kind of weight that doesn't distribute itself across days but settles and compresses. I needed the specific medicine of Kellner Lake. I needed the weight of that silence to replace the weight I was carrying. I told my brother Danny where I was going and when to expect me back. I loaded the truck with gear and food and drove the 3 hours from Marquette in the first light of a Thursday morning, the forest along the roads going orange and yellow in the early October. Color the air clean and cold coming through the cracked window. Thursday evening, I had my camp set up and my first dinner eaten, and I sat at the lake's edge watching the last light go off the water and felt for the first time in months something that resembled peace. That feeling lasted until Friday afternoon. Friday morning was what it needed to be. I was on the water before first light, paddling the canoe north to work the rocky points while the mist was still on the lake, and the light was doing the particular thing it does in October when it comes through pine canopy at low angles and turns everything gold and specific. I caught smallmouth bass steadily through the morning, nothing enormous but solid fish, the kind of fishing where you're in a rhythm, and the rhythm is working, and the world outside that rhythm becomes irrelevant. I lost track of time, the way you lose track of time when something is going right, and when I finally checked my phone, it was almost 11, and I'd been on the water for 5 hours. I ate lunch on a granite outcropping on the northeast shore, the same one Vic had picked the first day we fished the lake together. Cold sandwich thermos coffee, the lake spread out in front of me under a sky that had gone from clear to high cloud without my noticing. Good lunch. Good morning. I was starting to believe the trip was going to do what I'd needed it to do. I fished through the early afternoon, and then in the middle of the afternoon I paddled down to the south end to check the bog area. The south end is different in character from the north, where the north shore is open and bright. The south end is closed in by the tag alder and the cedars, the water shallow and dark, and obscured by floating vegetation in places. It smells different down there, too. The bog smell of decomposing organic material and still water, which some people find unpleasant, and which I've always found appropriate for the place part of its character. I was working along the weed edge at the bogs, near margin casting toward the pockets in the vegetation where perch hold in October when the birds stopped. I want to be careful about how I describe this, because the precise nature of what happened matters for what follows. The south end of Kellner Lake in October is not a quiet place in the way that people who haven't spent time in the northern forest might expect. There are chickadees in the alders. There are jays in the pines. There are nuthatches on the tree trunks, and kingfishers along the water line, and the occasional passage of migrating waterfowl overhead. The ambient bird activity of a fall afternoon in that kind of habitat is constant and layered a background of movement and sound that you stop consciously registering after a while, the way you stop consciously registering traffic noise if you live near a road. At approximately 3:40 in the afternoon, all of that stopped simultaneously, not gradually. Not bird by bird, the way the chorus diminishes when a hawk works through. All of it at once between one moment and the next. The jays that had been loud in the pines to my west simply went silent. The chickadees in the alders beside me simply stopped. A pair of buffleheads that had been feeding at the open water edge of the bog lifted off without the usual flushing call, lifted silently and turned south and were gone. In the space left by their absence, nothing. Not the peaceful nothing of a calm afternoon. A pressured nothing, the kind of nothing that is made by the removal of something that was previously present. The kind of nothing that has a cause. I stopped casting. I held the paddle across my knees and I sat in the canoe and I listened and I looked at the alders and the cedar fringe along the south shore and at the pine line that began about 30 yards back from the water. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. The water under the canoe was absolutely still. And then there was the feeling. I know how this sounds, and I'm going to say it anyway, because leaving it out would be dishonest, the feeling of being observed. Not the general awareness of being in wild country, where you are always potentially in something's sightline. The specific directed, focused feeling of a particular pair of eyes having found you and holding on. Every person who has worked in law enforcement long enough develops some version of this sensitivity pattern, recognition operating below the level of thought, assembling peripheral data into a conclusion before the conscious mind has caught up. I had felt this feeling before. I trusted it. Something in the tree line was watching me. I did not use my binoculars. I looked at the tree line with my naked eye for approximately 2 minutes and saw no movement, no defined shape, nothing I could point to and name. The feeling did not diminish. I paddled back to the north end and pulled the canoe out of the water. I told myself it was a bear. The UP has plenty of black bears, and bears produce exactly the effect I'd just experienced. The bird's silence, the feeling of something large and alert in the area, the vague sense of being assessed. I'd been in bear country for 50 years and knew the feeling, and this was consistent with it. I told myself this with the deliberate reasonableness of a man who has learned to think clearly under pressure and was applying that skill now, and I mostly believed it, and I made dinner and read until dark and went to sleep. Saturday I was up at 5:30 and on the water at first light. The morning started normally. The birds were active. The cut-off from the previous afternoon had clearly been temporary, whatever had caused it, having moved on, and the lake was doing its October thing in the early light. I fished the north shore first, then worked my way around the east side toward the south end, taking my time enjoying the morning. It was around 8 o'clock when I paddled close to the south shore to work the edge of the weed bed and put the canoe's bow onto a small mud flat to hold my position. The flat was maybe 10 feet across the mud, dark and soft at the water's edge, and it was printed with tracks. I've learned animal tracks the way people who grow up in the UP learn them through accumulated experience, through the specific instruction of people who knew them before me, and through the reinforcement of 23 years of law enforcement work that required reading sign in the field on a regular basis. I can identify the tracks of every animal that lives in the Ottawa National Forest with reasonable confidence. I know black bear front and rear paw, white-tailed deer gray wolf, coyote, otter, beaver, raccoon, mink, fisher, porcupine, varying, hare, red squirrel, and the rest. I know what distortion does to prints in different substrate conditions. I know how time and weather degrade prints and how to read the degradation to estimate age. The mud flat showed deer, raccoon, and otter, all easily identified, and one partial impression that I could not identify. The impression was at the water's edge, partially obscured by a deer track that had been made on top of it, and was therefore more recent. What remained visible was an oval depression approximately 8 to 9 inches at its longest axis, with what appeared to be elongated digit marks at the anterior end, 3 of them clearly defined, a fourth possibly present but uncertain due to the overlying deer track. The impression was deep in the soft mud, which indicated significant weight. The digit marks where visible were long and narrow, longer relative to the overall impression than any animal print I could place. It was not a bear. Bear front paw is 5-toed broad with a distinctive claw mark pattern. Bear rear paw is more elongated and has a visible heel pad. This was neither. It was not a human foot. It was too large for a normal human foot, and the digit proportions were wrong. I photographed it with my phone, taking multiple shots from multiple angles in the available morning light. The resolution was adequate for the conditions. You could see the impression clearly. I put my phone back in my pocket and I looked at the south shoreline and the cedar fringe and the pine line beyond it for a long time. Then I paddled back to camp and I thought carefully about whether to stay or go. I stayed. Some combination of stubbornness and the particular cop habit of not leaving a scene before you've gathered everything available kept me there. Also, if I'm being honest, Something else, the detective's instinct that says a puzzle that makes you uncomfortable is exactly the puzzle you should stay with, because the discomfort is information, and information is what you came for. That instinct, in retrospect, was not calibrated for this situation. Saturday afternoon was uneventful. I fished. I made a solid meal pasta from the camp stove, which is one of my camping staples, reliable and filling. I walked the camp perimeter before dark, the way I'd started doing after the bird incident, checking the tree line on all sides. Nothing notable, no tracks in the soft ground at the clearing's edge that I hadn't made myself. No disturbance in the underbrush. The woods were doing their normal Saturday afternoon in October business. I sat at the camp stove after dinner and drank coffee and watched the lake go from pewter to black as the light left it. And I listened to the lake sounds, a great horned owl somewhere on the east shore, the occasional splash of a muskrat in the shallows, the creak of the pines in a light wind that had come up from the northwest. Normal. Completely normal. I was in my tent by 9 and asleep by 9:30. I woke up at 1:56 in the morning. I know the exact time because my first act on waking was to check my watch, a habit from decades of shift work that has never left me. 1:56 a.m., Saturday night into Sunday morning, October 2019. I came awake the way I've come awake perhaps a dozen times in my life, not from sound or movement or dream, but from the complete and instantaneous transition from sleep to full alert that the body makes when something in the environment has registered at the level below conscious thought. The hindbrain receiving a signal and broadcasting it upward, something has changed, wake up. I lay still. I did not move. I listened. The owl was gone. The muskrat was gone. The light wind in the pines gone. The silence was the silence from Friday afternoon, magnified and deepened, the specific pressured, nothing of everything having stopped at once. And the smell. I'm going to try to describe this smell accurately, and I'm going to fail, but I'm going to try anyway because it was a central fact of everything that followed, and leaving it inadequately described would be worse than failing to describe it fully. It was organic in the way that deep organic processes are organic, not the surface organic of fresh vegetation or even fresh decay, but something from further down in the sequence, something that had been going on for a long time. There was sweetness in it, the way certain kinds of rot have sweetness. But the sweetness was a surface note, and what was beneath it was older and stranger, and I did not have a reference for it in 30 years of spending time in the woods and 23 years of working scenes where organic material in various states was present. I have smelled bodies in the field. I have smelled the specific biological output of wounds and internal injuries. What I was smelling in my tent at 2 in the morning on the shore of Kellner Lake was related to those things in the way that a word in a foreign language you don't speak is related to its English translation. You can feel the connection without being able to name it. I unzipped my sleeping bag slowly. I had my flashlight on the pad beside me and my service pistol in its holster on the tent's center pole, and I took both without turning on the light. I sat for another 30 seconds listening. The smell was present and consistent. Whatever was producing it was not moving or was moving very slowly in a fixed direction. No change in intensity. From outside the tent, from the tree line on the north side of the clearing, I heard something move. I need to be specific about this. Not the crash and snap of a large animal moving through brush without concern for noise. Not the tentative rustling of a small animal investigating something. Something in between the sound of something large moving carefully, trying to minimize noise and not fully succeeding. A branch giving under weight. A body brushing a trunk. The compression of pine needle duff underfoot, barely audible but present. And underneath those sounds so low that I had to question whether I was hearing it at all, a vocalization. Not a word. Not an animal call. Something between a low, sustained murmur with the quality of intentional sound, sound being shaped by something that had a purpose in making it. Duration and emphasis not random, not language in any form I could recognize, but not silence either. I unzipped the tent door and went outside. I stood in the clearing in 1:58 in the morning and let my eyes adjust to the starlight. It was clear and very cold, the temperature somewhere around 28 degrees by. Feel the ground under my boots, crunchy with frost. The stars were the full up October display, overwhelming the Milky Way, a genuine structural feature of the sky, the kind of sky that makes you understand why human beings invented astronomy. I noted this the way you note irrelevant facts when your attention is fully engaged elsewhere. I did not turn on my flashlight. Position giveaway. Basic field logic. I stood and I waited and I let the starlight do what it was going to do for my night vision. The smell was stronger outside the tent. Noticeably stronger. Whatever was producing it was closer than it had seemed through the tent fabric, or the tent had been absorbing more of it than I'd realized. I scanned the tree line, north first, where the sound had come from. The pines stood in their ranks at the clearing's edge, dark trunks against darker space between them, the starlight producing just enough contrast to distinguish solid from void. I looked for movement. I looked for shape. I looked for the particular disruption of a silhouette that occurs when something large is present among trees. Nothing I could define. The tree line was the tree line. I was starting to think about whether to use the flashlight when I registered the movement to my left. Not in front of me. To my left. On the west side of the clearing, not the north. Whatever had been making noise in the north tree line had moved while I was looking at the north tree line, had circled quietly around to the west, was now in the pines on my left side, closer to me than the north tree line had been, and was not making the sound of movement anymore. It was very close to the clearing edge, 20 yards, maybe less, and the smell was coming from that direction now, not from the north. I turned left slowly. I turned on the flashlight. The beam hit the west tree line at full power, 500 lumens, a serious tactical light, the kind that turns night into harsh theater in a 30-foot radius. The pines on the western edge of the clearing lit up their trunks pale and bright, the shadows between them going absolute black by contrast. I swept the beam across the tree line and found nothing. Then I swept it again slower, and at the far edge of the beam's coherent range, the distance where 500 lumens starts losing the argument with darkness, something moved, not flinching away, not the startled retreat of an animal caught by light. Lateral movement, slow and deliberate, slipping from behind one pine trunk to behind the next, maintaining the cover of the forest edge while moving northward. The movement was fluid, unhurried, the movement of something that was not surprised and was not afraid. I saw enough. Large, the size of the disruption in the beam's edge was inconsistent with anything under 6 feet in height and substantial in mass. Moving on 2 legs, moving with a quality of control that I associate with things that have been moving through this specific terrain for a long time. The proportions were wrong. I went back into the tent. I am going to tell you what the next 4 hours were like as honestly as I can, which means telling you things about myself that are not comfortable to tell. I sat in the corner of my tent furthest from the door, with my back against my sleeping bag and my pistol in my hands. I had the flashlight on my knee off. I did not go back outside. I did not text anyone. I had no signal, and also my phone had a screen bright enough to be visible through tent fabric, and I was not going to advertise my position. I did not call out. I did not do anything except sit and breathe and listen. The smell did not diminish. It remained at a consistent level that my nose would have adapted to, except that it kept presenting the same low-level wrong note that prevented adaptation. Like a sound that's almost a sound, your ear keeps going back to it. At approximately 2:30, I heard it move again, from the west tree line where it had been northward around the clearing perimeter. Moving slowly, steadily, in no hurry. I tracked the sound as far as I could. It went north and then east, and then I lost it, which meant it had either stopped or moved beyond the range of what I could hear from inside the tent. At 3:15, the vocalization returned, closer this time. I could not determine direction with any confidence. It seemed to surround me, which I know is not physically possible, and which I attribute to the particular acoustic effects of the tent fabric and the pine trees and the cleared space of the camp. But it was close. The low murmuring quality, the shaped non-language coming and going over about 10 minutes and then stopping. I will tell you something that I've only told my therapist. During those 10 minutes with that sound present, I was crying. Not from pain and not from emotion in any way I could articulate, from fear, from the most primitive and total fear I have experienced in 51 years of living. The kind of fear that lives below the rational mind, and that the rational mind can observe but cannot address. I was a trained law enforcement officer with a loaded weapon in a territory I had known for 36 years, and I was sitting in a tent in the dark crying because something was outside that I did not have any framework for, and my body understood this before my mind could, and my body's response was fear at a depth I had not previously reached. I stopped crying when the vocalization stopped. I controlled my breathing. I applied the training that had never failed me in 23 years, and I got my heart rate down, and I breathed slowly, and I sat in the corner of my tent, and I waited. At 4:03 in the morning, the smell changed, not went away, changed. A new component appeared overlaid on the baseline, something that I can only describe as chemical in the specific way that burning is chemical. Not smoke, not fire. Something metabolic, some biological process producing heat and producing the olfactory output of that heat at an intensity that was faint but clear, and that was new after 2 hours of the baseline. The breathing began. From outside the tent, from the south, from the direction of the water. Not my breathing. Slow, careful, controlled breathing. The specific rhythm of something that understood that breathing made sound and was managing its own output. The breathing of something aware of the information that sound provides. It was in the shallows. I heard it enter the water, the soft displacement of shallow water, the give of the muddy bottom under significant weight. The south end of the lake, the bog end where I'd found the track Saturday morning, moving slowly along the water line, audible only because the night was so absolutely still. I don't know why it went into the water. I've thought about this many times, and I don't have an answer. I know it went into the water and moved along the shore for approximately 10 minutes, and then the water sounds faded southward and went silent. I sat until first light. Dawn in the UP in October comes slowly. The darkness goes through gradations of dark gray before anything approaches light, and the process takes almost an hour from first suggestion to genuine visibility. I watched it through the tent mesh, and I timed my exit for the point where I could see clearly to the tree line. 7:12 in the morning. I unzipped the tent door and went out. The smell was gone, completely and immediately gone, replaced by the normal morning smells of cold air and pine resin and frost. Not faded, gone. The way a sound is gone when the source of it has moved far enough away, rather than when it has diminished. I walked the perimeter. West tree line first, where I'd seen the movement. At two trees approximately 22 yards from the clearing's edge, a white pine and a red pine, standing about 6 feet apart, I found marks on the trunks. Not tool marks. Not the sign of a human with a knife or a hatchet. Marks made by something biological applied with force. Vertical scores, 4 to a grouping in close parallels, each between 7 and 9 inches long. The bark along the marks was displaced, pushed aside, and in some places stripped entirely, revealing the pale wood beneath. In 2 places, the exposed wood bore a dark residue, too dark to be sap, and with a consistency that I photographed and did not touch. The marks were fresh. The displaced bark was still pale and uncured, not yet oxidized to the darker color that exposure produces over hours. The marks had been made during the night. I measured their height against my own body. The lowest was at approximately 4 feet off the ground. The highest was at approximately 7 feet. Whatever had made them had been standing at the base of the tree and had reached upward to do it. The marks were consistent with something with narrow, strong, hard-tipped digits, applying downward force from a height. I photographed everything. I documented the spacing, the depth, the height, the orientation. Cop training. Preserve the scene before you touch it. South to the water. The mud at the bog end showed what I'd expected: disturbed substrate. Along approximately 40 feet of water line, the mud churned and pressed by something moving through the shallows during the night. Not clean tracks, the movement had been too slow and the substrate too soft for defined impressions. But the disturbance was real, and its extent and character were consistent with something large having moved through that area. At the near edge of the disturbed mud, placed in the substrate, in a position that was not accidental, was a piece of bone. I stood over it for a long time before I did anything else. It was small, 3 inches, maybe 3.5. White with age, smooth, without the fresh, wet look of recently separated bone. Old bone from something that had died long enough ago to be fully desiccated. I could not determine species from visual inspection, too eroded for the surface features that allow identification. It had been placed upright in the soft mud, angled slightly positioned so that its long axis pointed toward my camp, not fallen, not deposited by water movement or by the passage of whatever had been in the shallows. Placed, deliberately with intention pointing toward the place where I had spent the night. I photographed it from 3 angles. Then I packed my camp. Everything. Ground cloth sleeping bag pad, camp stove cooler, tent poles, tent stakes, rain fly. I put everything in the truck and I put the canoe on the roof rack and I drove out. I did not stop to fish. I did not take a last look at the lake. I did not say anything out loud or internally that functioned as a goodbye. I drove the 2-track to the Forest Service Road and the Forest Service Road to the County Road, and I did not let myself stop until I was on a paved surface with sight lines in both directions. Danny's kitchen. Midnight. 2 beers on the table, and Danny with the look of a man who is deciding in real time how much to believe and how much to protect me from my own experience. He landed on bear with mange, which was generous, and which I let him have. My therapist's office. 8 months later. The whole account delivered with the flatness of something that has been compressed by time and needs decompression. She said the experience was real. She said the fear was appropriate. She said what you choose to do with both of those things is your decision. What I chose to do was stop going back to Kellner Lake and stop fishing alone in deep country and do the digging that the cop in me wouldn't let rest, and then carry what the digging produced for 4 years before writing this. Here is what the digging produced. I pulled missing persons reports for the Ottawa National Forest area going back 20 years. I had the access and the contacts to do this without difficulty. 17 cases over 20 years. 12 resolved hikers found hunters located medical emergencies addressed 1 drowning recovery. 5 unresolved. 5 people who walked into that national forest over 20 years and did not come back. 3 of the 5 were within the Kellner Lake watershed, within a geographic radius that includes the lake and the country around it for approximately 8 miles in every direction. 1 in 2003, 1 in 2011, 1 in 2017. All solo. All in late September or October. All last known to be in the area by their own accounts, trip plans left with family vehicles found at forest access points, no indication of foul play, no remains recovered, no explanation. The 2017 case in particular. A retired school teacher from Marquette, 64 years old, an experienced outdoorsman who had been hiking the UP forests for 40 years, last seen by himself by his own log at a camp approximately 4 miles south of Kellner Lake on a Thursday night in October. His vehicle was at the trailhead Friday morning. His camp was intact when searchers found it Saturday. His gear was there. His food was there. His boots were outside the tent the way you leave boots when you go to bed with the expectation of putting them on in the morning. He was not there. I am not making the claim that connects those 5 people to what was in the woods around my camp on that Saturday night in October 2019. I'm a retired detective and I don't make claims without evidence. And what I have is correlation and inference, not evidence. But I am making a different claim, and the different claim is this: something is in those woods. Something that watches, something that circles, something that leaves things, something that has been there long enough to have moved through that country with the confidence of long familiarity, and that has been doing whatever it does in those pines for longer than any of the 5 missing people's disappearances span. I don't know what it is. I've spent 4 years trying to find a framework that fits the totality of what I experienced and what the record suggests, and I don't have one. Not a bear, not a person, not anything in my experience or in the experience I can access through available records. What I know is the smell. What I know is the 2-legged movement at the edge of 500 lumens of light. What I know is the marks on the trees and the bone in the mud and the way the birds went silent before I was aware of anything, and the fact that wildlife collectively and immediately understood something that took me hours to partially understand. Marcus, I know you're reading this. I know you've been waiting for the version that didn't have things left out, and here it is. You're going into country like the country around Kellner Lake. You're going to go into it alone because your work requires it. I am not going to tell you not to go because that would be asking you not to be who you are, and also because whatever is in that part of the Ottawa National Forest is not everywhere, and the odds on any given day in any given section of forest are in your favor. I'm also not going to pretend I didn't spend 4 years deciding whether to tell you this, and that the deciding wasn't as much about protecting you from knowing as protecting myself from saying it. What I'm going to tell you is what I know. Pay attention to the birds. The wildlife in those forests has senses we have lost. When everything goes quiet at once, it is not a coincidence, and it is not a false alarm, and it does not mean a specific thing. It means something of sufficient size and strangeness has entered the area, and every living thing with the sense to do so has registered it. That's your first warning. Trust the smell. I don't have a better description than I've given you, and I'm not going to try for one. You'll know it if you encounter it. It's the kind of smell your body responds to before your mind identifies it, and your body's response is the information. Don't use your light to look for it. Light tells it where you are, and it already knows the terrain, and you don't. That's an unfavorable tactical trade. Don't stay alone if you feel the warning signs. I stayed because I was stubborn, and because the detective in me wanted more information, and because I told myself what I was experiencing had a rational explanation. I was right that it had an explanation. I was wrong to assume the explanation would be one I could use. Come home. whatever it is, can have Kellner Lake. Come home. I fish with my brother Danny now on the lakes around Ishpeming that we grew up fishing. Easier access. Other trucks in the parking areas. The kind of lake where if something went wrong, help was a manageable distance away. The fishing is good and Danny is good company, and I sleep better after those trips than I slept for the first year after Kellner Lake. Britta calls on Sundays and asks how I'm sleeping. I tell her I'm sleeping fine. This is mostly true now. The dreams that were consistent through the first winter, the smell in the dreams, the pressure of 2 in the morning in a tent in October, have faded to occasional. My therapist calls this integration. The experience is still there, it's just stopped dominating. What hasn't integrated is the knowledge. The knowledge sits in me at a steady low-level present, without demanding attention the way knowledge does when you've verified it well enough that you no longer need to keep checking. Something is in the pines around Kellner Lake. It has been there for a long time. 5 people went into the country around it over 20 years and did not come back. I went in and came back, and I don't know why I came back and they didn't. And thinking about that too long is the thing that still gets into the dreams sometimes. The bone is in a plastic evidence bag in my desk drawer. I should have left it where I found it. I picked it up when I was breaking camp, and I've had it ever since, and I'm not entirely sure why. It's old bone. It's nothing I can identify. It was placed in the mud, pointing at the place where I slept by something that had been in the shallows of a bog at 4 in the morning. I look at it sometimes. I don't know what I'm looking for. The answer it would give me, if I could read it, is probably not an answer I'd be glad to have. Don't fish alone in the deep woods. If the birds go quiet all at once, don't wait to find out why. If you smell something you don't have a word for and your body understands it before your mind does listen to your body is reading very old information and it is not wrong. Just go. Come home.